Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed the food, and we're going to have a great program tonight. My name is Aisha Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. I will be your moderator this evening. As many of you all know, June is Torture Awareness Month, and we are just coming to an end of June. And today, the 26th, is the International Day in support of victims of torture. During the whole month of June, KARAMAH and the Constitution Project and the National Religious Council Against Torture have been traveling all over the country holding these events to discuss and raise awareness around US-sanctioned torture. Two of our speakers sat on a task force that studied these practices in depth. They will tell you a lot more about their findings. And our last speaker joins us, and I will be introducing all of them. She was not on the panel, but will be giving wonderful remarks as well. In the interest of time, I'm only going to provide you with an abbreviated introduction for each of our speakers, though they are very esteemed, and I could go on and on about their many accomplishments. The event is being live streamed, and I want to get this right. We encourage all of you to tweet while you are here, and the hashtag is #ExposeTorture. If you are watching on the live webcast, you can also tune in to our Twitter and Facebook and have a conversation there as well with the same hashtag. First, we will hear from Ambassador James R. Jones. Ambassador Jones is a partner at Manatt, Phelps, and Phillips, and former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. He was a Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Oklahoma, and at 28 years old, President Johnson selected him as Appointments Secretary, a position equivalent to the White House Chief of Staff. He was the youngest person in history to hold that position. Ambassador Jones also served previously as the president of Warnaco International, as well as the chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange in New York. He earned his LLB from Georgetown University, and he was the co-chair on the Constitution Project's task force on detainee treatment, of which there are copies downstairs. Ambassador Jones.
Thank you very much, Isha, for that introduction and for letting me participate in this program this evening. She said I was the youngest person to hold that position in the White House. I might say, I got to turn this thing off. It always rings in the middle of a speech. The second youngest was Dick Cheney. We have very different views on an awful lot of subjects. So I should state that from the outset. The Constitution Project contacted me, 3 years ago, 2 years ago now, more than that, 4 years ago almost, and pointed out that the Obama administration nor Congress was going to do any kind of a retrospective or review of our activities post 9/11, particularly with regard to detainees within our purview. And they felt that there were so many constitutional issues revolving around that, they wanted to put together a panel, a task force, to look in depth into these issues and to make a report, and asked me to be co-chairman. So the other co-chairman would be Asa Hutchinson, who's a former Republican congressman from Arkansas, former Undersecretary of Department of Homeland Security in the Bush administration, currently running for governor in his home state of Arkansas. And I said that there are really two issues that concern me. This has not been an area of what I've done most of my political and business life, but one, that it be truly bipartisan, and two, that the philosophical differences, liberal, conservative, not be tilted in any one direction, and that the members of the commission have an open mind and really go where the facts lead them. And I'm very proud to say that that's exactly what the task force did. we had an exceptional group of people in the task force. And for example, we had, as I said, Asa Hutchinson. We had Dr. El-Hibri, very distinguished in the legal profession. We had Bill Sessions, who's the former director of the FBI, a Republican, originally from Texas, a federal district judge before the FBI directorship. We had Tom Pickering, who had been the U.S. ambassador to 6 different countries, I believe it was, to Russia, to India, to Israel, to Jordan, to El Salvador, to Nigeria, and to the United Nations. A very distinguished diplomat. We had 2 generals, 2 retired generals, Claudia Kennedy, the first woman to be a 3-star general, and the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army for Intelligence. We had David Irvine, who was a brigadier general in charge, and some of the things he taught in the military were interrogations and how to treat prisoners. He was also a Republican legislator from state of Utah. So we had a good mix of Democrats and Republicans. We had ethicists, we had medical doctors, and we started out with 13 commissioners. 2 of them had to drop off because of appointments to other positions that would be in conflict. And we then had a total of 11. We issued a report, which I encourage you to read. It had about 25 recommendations and findings. I won't touch on all 25 here, but I encourage you to read those. And we had unanimous agreement among all these differences of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. We had unanimous agreement on all of our findings and recommendations except one, where we had a minority view. We spent 2 years studying the issues. We had a great staff headed by Nick Lewis, who was a former New York Times reporter, very well respected journalist. And we had some young people from the different law schools, as well as several law firms who did briefs for us, and spent 2 years of developing the information and then presenting it to the task force, and the task force voting. As I say, it was unanimous except on one issue. We had no subpoena power. We could only, and we had no access to documents that were not made public, official documents. So we did have some trips abroad to some of the black sites that were prisoners, where detainees were captured, whisked off to these black sites and detained for a long period of time. There were about 4 countries there: Romania, Lithuania, Nigeria, and one other country I'm forgetting. We had visits to Guantanamo to see the prison situation there. And we had several interviews with those who were interrogators, interviews with detainees who had since been released. We tried to interview all sides of the story. And we, for example, Jose Rodriguez, who's been very critical of a lot of these reports, and was the CIA, was one of the prime movers of the interrogation policy. We wanted to interview him. We asked him. I personally talked to him, and he just declined to talk with us. But we did a very thorough job and issued the report, I guess it was 2013, a year and a half or so ago. It got good response. We worked with Senator Feinstein then, who's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She was trying to do an official report on detainee treatment. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the report, with the politics on Capitol Hill, the Republicans basically boycotted the hearings, and so it was a Democrat-only report that was issued. However, when we had encouraged, and we talked after our report was released, we talked to a number of the senators, both Democratic and Republican, on the committee, and urged them to vote the report out and to make it public. And I will say that all the Democrats voted for it, and Senator Susan Collins of Maine, a Republican, voted to issue it, and Senator King, an independent, former governor of Maine, who's in the Senate now, also voted to issue it. So it can be said it was a bipartisan vote to issue this report. Now that report is what, 6,000 or 7,000 pages, and the executive part of that, the executive brief, is somewhere around 500 or 600 pages. That report has been sent to the CIA, where it's been for quite a few weeks now, maybe a few months. CIA has, in my judgment, been very slow to respond to it. We had encouraged in our report that the Senate report be issued and that the rebuttal or the minority report by the CIA also be made public, so that the public at large can view the various works and make up their own mind. CIA finally has issued its redacted version. In other words, they can redact, they can suggest a redaction of many of the things in the Senate report. I have not seen their response, nor have I seen the Senate committee response or report. I understand the redactions are enormous, so that you can't really make sense of the report when you get, if you get through the redactions. There is a court case, and as of last Friday, the CIA said that the report will be issued by August 29th. And so that's at least gives us some time frame in which this report may be made open to the public. The report's now over at the White House, where they have to look at the CIA's response and see what is good and what should not be allowed. So that's kind of where the issue is. We found, as I say, 25 or so findings and recommendations. But to me, there were 2 or 3 overriding things that I want to mention tonight. First of all, I can fully understand the concern that existed in our country and among the various agencies of government after 9/11. We didn't know this was a new enemy, it was a new war, and one we hadn't really been exposed to before. And the temptation to overreact and to bend the law or to violate the law is there when you're trying to get a handle on this. But we found in these interrogations, first of all, that there really was torture. And we had a unanimous agreement on that the United States government under the did torture detainees within our possession. The other thing we found no persuasive evidence that torture produced accurate or actionable information that we could use. In fact, we found in some cases it produced just the opposite, inaccurate information on which decisions were made. So that's one of the issues I want to mention tonight, and we can come back to. The other issue was on Guantanamo. This is the one where we did not reach unanimous agreement. There was a small minority on the task force that felt that our majority recommendation of closing Guantanamo after the prisoners had been removed to the United States to face Article 3, which federal court trials, and be imprisoned here in the United States until those trials were completed. A minority of the court did not believe that they could support that, primarily for the small minority of prisoners, detainees still at Guantanamo, roughly 20-some, who were considered dangerous to the United States still, and who, for a variety of reasons, part of which evidence had been so compromised that it would be impossible to get a fair trial in a federal district court, that those prisoners were still such a threat to the United States that you could not remove them to the United States, and you had to hold them. The best place to hold them was Guantanamo. As I say, the majority opinion did not agree with that. In any event, I think we're going to be seeing in the next couple of months reports, this report made public. My time is running out, thus I'm just going to conclude here. One of the things I really hope you will do is to read our report, read what is released of the Senate report, and draw your own conclusions, and not just do that, but then agitate public officials to do something about it. I think there are a number of things that need to be done. For example, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which we had followed in this country for roughly 50 years since the end of World War II, was amended in 2006 and basically gave the indication to our troops that certain things could be done, which we believe was violating of our Constitution and certainly of our values and our principles. So when you read the report, I hope you will not just read it and draw your own conclusion, but after you draw your conclusion, I hope you will make that conclusion known and agitate with public officials who can do something about it. Look forward to your questions.
If there are any folks in the back that can't see, there's a couple of seats up front that we're going to have a PowerPoint at the next presentation, so it may be a little bit more visible to you. There's a seat in the front row and a couple on the front over here as well. Thank you, Ambassador Jones, for your overview. That report is available in a shorter version downstairs. I see some of you have already grabbed it. And it is also available at the Constitution Project website, which is theconstitutionproject.org. Next, we are going to hear from Dr. Azizah El-Hibri. Dr. El-Hibri is a professor emerita at the University of Richmond Law School and is the founder and chair of KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. In 2011, Dr. El-Hibri was appointed by President Obama to serve as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And for the last 2 decades, Dr. El-Hibri has spent her time writing extensively on issues of Muslim women's rights, Islam and democracy, and human rights. Dr. El-Hibri also sat on the Constitution Project Task Force on Detainee Treatment. Dr. El-Hibri.
Thank you. Glad to see you all here. And I want to say that I was very happy to join this wonderful task force organized by the Constitution Project and its president, Virginia Sloan, who goes back, way back with KARAMAH. In 2002, it joined us also in a town hall meeting to discuss the raid on Muslim businesses and homes that some of you might not have heard about at that time, and discuss it from a constitutional point of view. So I was very glad to be involved again in this project. We all hear about torture. We know what that term means. We've heard about Guantanamo, but it seems to me that a lot of these times the words tend to be too abstract. And what I would like to do today in this discussion is to flesh out some of the meaning of the words we have been using. The results of the study were shocking. I will share with you some language from that report and encourage you to go downstairs, get a copy of the full report, and read it for yourselves. And the most notable finding of our panel, I reiterate, is that it is indisputable that the United States engaged in the practice of torture. So let me note, in our report, we discussed issues like black sites, and there were many sites where detainees endured cruel and painful punishment. You have all heard about Abu Ghraib, and we've all seen pictures of that, but that was only one of many sites. Many detainees were rendered, a term that some of you have heard, to countries known for practicing torture. The belief was that if the US could not extract information from these detainees, torture in these rendition sites would. And this thesis, as we discovered, has proven to be false, and many innocent individuals have suffered from these renditions. So let me show you how the report describes these developments. The procedure of rendition. There you have, according to CIA officers, members of the rendition group follow a simple but standard procedure. Dressed head to toe in black, including masks, they blindfold and cut the clothes of their new captives, then administer an enema and sleeping drugs. They outfit the detainees in a diaper and jumpsuit for what can be a day-long trip. Their destinations, either a detention facility operated by cooperative countries in the Middle East and Central Asia, including Afghanistan, or one of the CIA's own covert prisons, referred to in classified documents as black sites. It is important to note that several of the rendition sites were governments with Muslim majority populations, i.e. Muslim countries. One wonders how these governments dare to claim to be Muslim when their own behavior flies directly in the face of the Quran and the prophetic hadith. If this was in a lecture on Islamic law, I would tell you all about human rights in Islam, but suffice it to say that the Prophet himself prohibited even the mistreatment of animals, including cats, dogs, donkeys, and birds. He went into that great a detail. And yet, in today's world, leaders of some Muslim countries have engaged in human torture, and there is no task force to study their actions or to take them to task. In this country, we can. We have heard about sleep deprivation and waterboarding. Here's what the report says about it. While they were being shackled in a standing position for purposes of sleep deprivation, detainees were kept in diapers rather than being unshackled or allowed to use a bucket or latrine, because nobody wanted to lose the effectiveness of the punishment. The CIA told the Office of Legal Counsel, thank you, in 2005 that releasing a detainee from shackles during sleep deprivation to urinate or defecate would interfere with the effectiveness of the sleep deprivation technique. According to the Bradbury memos, the longest consecutive period a detainee was deprived of sleep was 180 hours. The OMS, that's the Office of Medical Services, guidelines describe waterboarding as by far, now you've heard all about waterboarding, and some people said it's not a big deal because we train our own combat forces in waterboarding, except that when we train them, they know they're not gonna die. And in this case, well, let's see what happens. So they describe waterboarding as by far the most traumatic of the enhanced interrogation techniques. Note the term enhanced interrogation, which is a euphemism really for torture. And the only one requiring the presence of a physician as opposed to a physician's assistant. This is how serious it is. Here are the risks. It discusses serious risks based on the CIA's previous experience administering the waterboard. For reasons of physical fatigue or psychological resignation, the subject may simply give up, allowing excessive filling of the airways and the loss of consciousness. The OMS stated that a series of several relatively rapid waterboard applications is medically acceptable. Several such sessions per 24 hours have been employed without apparent medical complication. But there is a cumulative effect as well. The OMS recommended a careful medical assessment before more than 15 waterboard applications within a 24-hour period, and warned of cumulative effects after 3 to 5 consecutive days of intense waterboarding. A part of what is being shown by the language that I'm putting in front of you now is the involvement of the medical profession in this behavior. We all know the oath that a doctor has to take in his profession, but also there is also responsibilities within the military. If you're given a direct order, you have to obey it. So some of the people involved in this process were in a situation of conflict. We have also heard and continue to hear about hunger strikes. These have not ended. And according to the report, hunger strikes had been used at Guantanamo before, most often to protest allegations of guards desecrating the Quran. According to Camp Delta standard operating procedures, MPs are instructed to avoid handling or touching the detainee's Quran whenever possible, and may only do so when security requires it under strict guidelines, which include the presence of a chaplain or a Muslim interpreter. According to news reports, a Quran was kicked, withheld from detainees, and put in a toilet. Sami al-Hajj told task force staff of his first hunger strike at Guantanamo as a protest. We used it for 1 day, 2 days, when they do something bad for our holy Quran. We also heard about forced feeding. Forced feeding was one solution to hunger strikes. They don't want to eat, we'll feed them by force. Now, of course, there is always a responsibility to save life. But was this designed to save life as a last resort because of the hunger strike, or was it misused in other ways? So let's see what was happening. This is a story about forced feeding, something we hear about a lot but do not fully understand. Sami al-Hajj here is speaking. He was force-fed, and this is how his description. They are supposed to feed you with 2 cans, small cans, but they feed us 24 cans and 24 bottles of water, continuous. And we were throwing up. It continues, and we're throwing up, and it continues. This is one feeding. It would take 8 hours like that. You are in chair until your cell becomes full of vomit. And after that, when they come and remove the feeding tube from the esophagus, they would grab the tube and just walk away with it. Have you ever had a tube down your throat and for medical reasons? And do you know how painful just having it delicately inserted there is? I've had that experience. And I shudder at the idea that somebody would yank it out. But that's not all. They walk away with it, then there was blood coming. And the guard takes it from you, and he goes to another detainee directly and inserts it without cleaning. There were other cruel, inhumane, and degrading techniques used, and now we're going to look at one of them. Al-Qahtani, detainee number 63, was suspected of being the intended 20th hijacker in the September 11 attacks. In October 2002, he was interrogated with military dogs present, deprived of sleep, and placed in stress positions, all while in isolation. And by the way, punishment in isolation is a whole other issue that one could discuss, whether in relationship to these people or in our prison system. According to an FBI agent, by the end of November, Al-Qahtani was evidencing behavior consistent with extreme psychological trauma, talking to non-existent people, reportedly hearing voices, crouching in a corner of the cell, covered with a sheet for hours on end. That's usually what happens when you keep people in isolation for extended periods. A publicly released interrogation log dated from November 23, 2002 to January 11, 2003 shows that his treatment only became harsher when they did not get out of him what they thought they should get. So Al-Qahtani was interrogated for approximately 20 hours a day for 7 weeks. Subjected to strip searches, including some in the presence of female interrogators, forced to wear women's underwear, led around on a leash, made to bark like a dog, and subjected to cold temperatures. Al-Qahtani was also forcibly injected with large quantities of IV fluid and forced to urinate on himself and given repeated enemas. Now, why do I have here a title of religious challenges? We did not discuss this at our committee, but in fact, many of the treatments that were visited on Al-Qahtani were basically designed to shock him either culturally or religiously. For example, in Islam, cleanliness is paramount. You cannot pray unless you are completely clean and not just ritually clean. And to have somebody urinate on themselves or to be kept in diapers for extended periods or also being exposed naked to other people, etc. All of these things are the kind of stuff that would make a person either culturally or religiously very stressed out. So I think part of the treatment was designed around who is this person. And by knowing what are his beliefs, his moral values, etc., the treatment was designed to just stress him on that basis. Now, according to psychiatrist Major Paul Burney, who attended training in techniques to exert physical and psychological pressures during interrogation, the instructor stressed time and time again that psychological investigations have proven that harsh interrogations do not work. At best, it will get you information that a prisoner thinks you want to hear to make the interrogation stop, make the pain stop. But that information is strongly likely to be false, which is what you had discussed. So let me close this section by a couple of comments. The most troubling aspect of Guantanamo today remains the indefinite nature of detention at the facility. Detainee counsel Joseph Margulis emphasizes that Guantanamo has changed. Okay, it's not that prison anymore. Okay, but it's still not a vacation spot. And when the administration, the Bush administration or the Obama administration describe it as a very different facility, in significant respects, they are right. Yet, Guantanamo's moral bankruptcy now is not that it is built around the creation of debilitating despair. Its moral bankruptcy now is that these guys are held without ever having been charged or tried or convicted of anything. Even those cleared for release are subject to continued detention due to the difficulty of transfers from Guantanamo. We are a country of laws. That is very important and distinctive about our country. And if we let that slide away because of fear or some other reason, then we're going to look to the world as if we are very similar to some of the regimes that we have criticized. Let me talk a little bit about global consequences of what happened at Guantanamo. There have been several attempts to sue high officials of the United States and Europe. The European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights attempted to do so in 2006, joined by or supported by the Center for Constitutional Rights here in the US and Amnesty International. Also, the Center for Constitutional Rights brought a criminal complaint against what's called the Bush Six, many of whom were lawyers, for cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment in 2009, and also there were attempted suits in Canada. What's most interesting, and I really don't know if you heard about it, is that actually the courts of Malaysia in 2012 convicted President Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and others in absentia of war crimes. How many heard about that? Okay, reasonable number. The Vatican says there was evidence of torture. And they considered this a more serious blow to the US than the events of September 11, because they said that was something that the US inflicted on itself. In 2010, in the UK, 12 former detainees reached settlement with the British government for its complicity in torture and abuse. And there are some cases pending. Even in Libya, I remember I was in Europe at a meeting and met a woman, a Libyan woman from the revolution that got rid of Gaddafi, telling me about the role of the US in the attempted assassination of her husband in complicity with Gaddafi. I don't know enough about that, but we have substantiated in our report that there were attempts, such as the kidnapping from Thailand and rendering to Libya some of the people who are now in the lead of the Libyan revolution. In the report, those who interviewed them say that they are surprised that these people who have been rendered are not angry at us. They're not bitter at us. What they really want is an apology. And that they have not gotten so far. One shocking aspect of this, which really sounds to me as very un-American, is that when one of these people were kidnapped, his name was Bilhaj, his wife was taken along with him. She was 4.5 months pregnant. She was chained to the floor, left for 5 days without food, only water. And there are other cases where the children were also taken along with the father. The consequences of this behavior is diverse for many. I see I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick. First of all, when you torture somebody, you're not only dehumanizing that other, but somehow you're dehumanizing yourself. So the impact, the negative impact affects both, and we've seen that happen with the stress syndrome and for returning people in this country. The damage is to the tortured, the torturer, and also to the military organization and to the allies, our allies, who in some cases would not give us somebody they arrested for fear that we are going to torture them. The detainees, quickly, what happened to them when they were freed? Social stigma. They got the social stigma without trial. Somebody said in our report that at least half of them easily are innocent. Yet, when these were released, and we don't know which ones, they had that stigma whether they were guilty or not. They couldn't find work because they came from Guantanamo. There was no financial support for them. There was no treatment for post-detention physical or mental problems. They had health problems. One person lost his leg altogether, others, eyes, etc. These are serious health disabilities and problems. No support for that. And of course, family troubles. The families are stressed out and sometimes disintegrate. They lost skills that sometimes in the past they had. For example, one of them was a translator, and he just forgot the second language he was translating into. At least he wasn't as good. He lost the social trust of those around him. People had limited, from Guantanamo, had limited mobility. I don't mean by that physical mobility. They didn't have IDs or documentation to travel around, some of them, so they couldn't move around freely. They were on watch lists. And the psychological effect on them was disintegration of personality, difficulty of dealing with normal life. They thought that would be the easiest thing. That was the most difficult thing, is to come back and fit in normal life. Their family was being fragmented. They were full of scars, but scars you couldn't see. They looked normal, but they weren't. Now, on the brighter side, there were a couple of programs that offered best practices for rehabilitation of these detainees. One of them was Switzerland, which freed them when they came to Switzerland, it gave the free detainees 3 years stipend, health care, and a family reunion, among other things. And Saudi Arabia had a rehabilitation program also to help them reintegrate into society. You can read a lot more about this in greater detail, but I hope that my discussion gave you a synopsis of the pain that has been inflicted and that has taken place, and what our government has done in the name of our security. So I would hope that you will go to the source, which is the full report, and read it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El-Hibri, for that important but frankly harrowing information. Finally, we will hear from Diane Randall. Diane Randall is the Executive Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, also known as FCNL. The FCNL's policies and legislative priorities are based on the belief that there is God in every person and that all creation has worth and dignity. Diane's engagement in policy and politics began in the early 80s when she was the director of the Omaha Nuclear Freeze Campaign. She has previously served as the executive director of Partnership for Strong Communities, a Connecticut-based nonprofit addressing homelessness, affordable housing, and community development. She has also directed the Connecticut Network to Abolish the Death Penalty and the Connecticut AIDS Residents Coalition. Diane?
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the speakers before me, the very esteemed speakers, Ambassador Jones and Dr. El-Hibri, for this very enlightened discussion of the Constitution Project's report. And I'm really here to offer a different perspective than that of a legal scholar or a legal report, and that is a faith perspective and the moral voice that I'm sure is shared by everyone in this room, whether you're a person who claims a faith tradition or not. What I'd like to do is to begin my remarks as Quakers often begin our activities together, and that is just with a moment of silence. And I think particularly given the statements we just heard, really, it is truly harrowing to think of this element of torture that has affected so many people. And on this day, that is a day to remember victims of torture, survivors of torture. I'd like to just ask us to pause for an extended moment and just reflect on both those who have suffered because they have been tortured, but those who have suffered because they have perpetrated this crime. Thank you. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a Quaker. The organization I work for is the Friends Committee on National Legislation for the Religious Society of Friends, and we are part of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. When the campaign began, before I was at FCNL, I believe they actually had offices in our building, and so we've long been involved. Our involvement with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture is the same of many people of faith, and that is that we believe there is that of God in every person. And because of that, we believe in the sense of dignity of every person. Therefore, for us and for, I think, many people of faith, torture is immoral. But as I reflect on how our country has responded to this and how I think people throughout both the United States and throughout the world feel, is I think most people believe torture is immoral. And it is on this basis that I think the broad majority of public, even if they don't understand the depth of what we've done, believe that we have acted wrongly in perpetrating torture, even in response to the fear or the anger that we may have felt as being victimized. And I think this element of understanding how we respond to other people is critical to understanding why we might have done this. Our ability to see people as less than human is I think, at the root of why we were willing to treat people as less than human. And it is only through an ability to see others, to see ourselves in others, and to understand how we would want to be treated, that we can back away and admit the wrongness of what we've done, and also seek a way to never perpetrate these kinds of crimes again. In fact, what Christians call the golden rule, many call the ethic of reciprocity, which is actually referred to in 21 religions, which is treat others as you would like to be treated. And that basic rule, I think, is one thing that people of faith and people who, again, don't even profess a belief in God can agree on, that in the most basic way that we regard other people, we must treat them as we would want to be treated. I think this very issue of dignity and the sense of worth of every person is common for faiths throughout the world. And as we saw following the use of torture by the CIA, by the defense, by the military following 9/11, we also saw faith communities begin to respond through study groups that they began talking within their churches, whether those faiths were Jewish, Catholic, Muslim. Throughout the United States, we've seen churches respond to this by beginning to investigate and try to understand what we as people of faith might do to respond to the torture that we saw, these stories, and now this very definitive report. I think it's incredibly important to have reports like this one from the Constitution Project, and I think it's very important that we've seen our own Senate Intelligence Committee vote to release the report that they voted to release publicly. And when that comes out, I think it will be an important statement again for us to refresh what we really did and to understand this at a deep level. Because the work that we do at FCNL is to advocate with Congress for changes. We very much try to be a prophetic voice, but to try to take pragmatic action in what can be done to change. But I think that the important thing to think about with what happened with torture is that the changes are not only political. Yes, there have to be political changes to these, but there have to be also social and cultural changes. We cannot begin to understand torture as a normal way of doing business, or even as a slightly extended reaction to something that we see as a problem. And so I think this idea of, for FCNL, our work is to lobby members of Congress day in and day out. We look at not only the issue of how can we close Guantanamo, but we look at what are the root causes of violent conflict that lead us to react militarily to solutions that could be resolved politically, that might lead to conditions that could exacerbate the use of torture, and to think about how can we both continue to speak about this as a wrongdoing, but also speak about what is a better way to live into the world. How do we live our faith into the world that is living from a place of love rather than a place of hate? I think this idea to try to respond with love, to use the golden rule, is one that people of faith aspire to. None of us do it perfectly, but it is our faith communities that give us some capacity to do that, but it's also our sense of community and solidarity with others that allows us to understand that there is a better way to respond to our own fears and to the conditions that lead to war. One of the concerns that was spoken of at the end here, as we talked about what these conditions caused, is not only what it did to the people who were tortured, but what it has done to us as a country, what it has done to us as a society, and what it means for us not only for our standing in the world and for how others regard us, which is critical to our own foreign policy and our own capacity to be effective in the world, but it's also, what does it mean to us when I think about what does it mean to us to be a country that practices torture? We are now in league with countries that we have often disdained as violating human rights. And I don't think that's the place that the United States wants to be. I think we need to look at how we can not only recognize what we've done, but apologize and seek some way to atone, if you will, for these wrongdoings, because they've hurt other people, but they've also hurt us. They have torn our moral fabric in a way that doesn't speak for who I am as an American, and I don't think speaks for probably most people in this room. The last slide that was put up here referred to moral bankruptcy, and I think that is not a condition that we want to have exist for the well-being of our society, far beyond what it means just for torture, but to think that we somehow are morally bankrupt. These kinds of violent activities against others, these violations of human rights, make us morally bankrupt. Ambassador Jones talked about the idea of once we see what's in these reports, I think the term he used was to agitate with our public officials. And that's music to my ears because we believe it's very important for us to be in dialogue with our elected officials. That in fact, being a good citizen is talking to them on a regular basis about what we think they should be doing better. I mentioned earlier that FCNL has been working on trying to push for the repeal of the authorization for the use of military force. And that 2001 law that passed with only one dissenting vote has been the justification for Guantanamo to stay open. It's been the justification for the use of lethal drone strikes. It's been the justification for the war in Afghanistan. And we believe it's time for our Congress to repeal that law, to repeal the authorization for the use of military force. And in fact, that will not stop the president from taking action should he feel he needs to, but it will restore the power to Congress to take action in response to some sort of threat that they may perceive. I invite you to join FCNL. I invite you to lobby with us, to be active with us. I invite you to join Intercat, which I will say has done an incredible job of convening faith voices across that are truly interfaith voices. I had the opportunity to participate in a White House meeting, and I think we had people from 20 different faith organizations there speaking to officials at the White House about this report. So I do believe that there's an opportunity for people of faith to be very active, not only in Washington, D.C. with your elected officials, but back in your local communities as well. Those of you who are active in churches, those of you who are active in faith communities of any kind, or civic communities, talk to your friends, talk to your families about this, and ask them to continue to speak out publicly and oppose the idea that the United States would ever use torture again, and to support the idea that we would publicly apologize for this grievous act that we have done, that's been done in our names. I'm going to stop there. I think there'll probably be a lot of questions about the Constitution report. Again, I want to thank both Dr. Jones and Dr. El-Hibri for their fine work on that report and urge you to take a look at it as well.
Thank you again to our panel. We now have about 45 minutes for questions. I will ask you two things. First is that you would speak up when you ask your question. I'm going to repeat the question because the event is being live streamed and we don't have a mic to hand to you. So I'll repeat the question and then it will be answered by our panelists. Also, I'm not being rude. I'm checking my phone to get online questions as well. So hopefully we will get everyone's questions answered. Do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
My name's Barbara. I came from Philadelphia. I'm a coordinator of one of our local Amnesty groups in the Philadelphia area. I would just like to get the panel's reaction. It must be back in 2008, 2009. I went to a conference. It was held by the Bakers. It was the Quid Conference, one of John Calvi's conferences. It was the second Quid Conference. And Professor, I think I'll get his name wrong, Alfred McCrory, I want to say McCrory, I'm not sure, he's a professor of history. He wrote a book, he did a lot of research, and wrote a book entitled A Question of Torture. And he actually delved into the CIA research on torture that goes back to the Cold War era and things like solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, the whole thing. And he spoke there and autographed books and whatever. But one of the things that he said that has always stayed with me is it was his conclusion that while some of the methods of torture that have been used are really modern takes on old, really, horrible methods that go back to the Middle Ages, he felt that the United States, our unique contribution to the world of torture was one, what they call self-inflicted torture. That's what it's called, but it means like the stress positions, the torture that does not leave physical marks, but does horrible psychological torture, psychological damage. That, and as Dr. El-Hibri mentioned, methods that are specifically targeted to shock and offend the detainees' religious beliefs. Do you have a reaction to that? Do you think that is a correct conclusion, or not correct, but do you agree with that?
Okay, the question is that there was a professor, McCrory, who wrote a book and about a question of torture, and he posited that the U.S. had a unique contribution to torture, and that was that there are self-inflicted torture, such as stress positions, which you cannot see visibly. And the second question is, or the second piece that he says is the U.S.'s unique form of torture is to shock and offend the detainees' religious beliefs. How do you feel about that position?
Well, I've spoken about that, and I think it's especially shocking in a country whose constitution guarantees freedom of religion to be then targeting the beliefs, the religious beliefs of this person as a way of humiliating him, creating horrible conflicts in his personality, stressing him, etc. I think that's really horrible. And maybe we should do something about that. That there are certain areas where you just can't go to get the kind of information you want. Because I agree with Diane. Human beings have dignity. In fact, well, under our laws, a person is presumed innocent until found guilty. And our organization, KARAMAH, is called KARAMAH because KARAMAH means dignity. And it's in the Quran, which says, we have given dignity to the children of Adam, meaning that our human dignity is not given or taken by a government or by society. It's something that God has given us, and we will have it all along. So for somebody to deny our human dignity also is denying their human dignity. And we need to do something about that as Americans who have been leading the global discussion on banning torture, on human rights, etc., and on criticizing other governments for doing things that we say are bad, but it appears that under certain circumstances we have engaged in them.
I would comment that, first of all, I have not done a study of torture, so I don't know that we inflicted this on the world. I think this was inflicted on us in many cases. And some of the guidelines that were given were based on what we do to some of our own people before they go into a military situation as a defense if this is imposed upon them. Never was intended to be an offensive position that we take as a nation. So I guess I would say that whether we initiated or contributed this to the world or not is immaterial. It just violates our values. And if we would just go back to observing the Geneva Conventions, which we signed and which we violated in many respects, according to our report, and if we would just impose on ourselves what we have criticized other nations for doing to our own people, we would be back where I think we should be morally.
If I may just add one more thing that we need to pay attention to. If we are targeting in our torture something that's religiously offensive to the people who are detained, and that religion exists in our society, what are we telling the people in our society who hold that religion? For example, when I read that one reason for hunger strikes is the desecration of the Quran, how do I feel as an American that somehow security considerations would allow somebody in our military forces to desecrate my holy Quran? That is going to affect me very seriously in terms of also by the way, freedom of exercise. Look around you. How many Muslims do you see today attending this session on torture? And what are the reasons?
Yes, in the front. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. You said that it's not the American way to torture. But I lived in Appalachia. I worked on social and environmental issues at the community level in Appalachia for 30 years. And I moved home last year to Washington, D.C. to find people sleeping on the streets in the dead of night. That's who we are as people, that we can allow a situation like this. How is that any different than allowing somebody to torture somebody else? I think we have a concept of who we are as a people that's far elevated above reality.
The question is that we are saying that this is not the American way to torture, and yet there's torture happening on the streets of DC, such as when the homeless are sleeping out in the cold. And how is that different from the torture that we're discussing here this evening?
Thanks for the question. I have the same reaction when I walk through Union Station and see people, often the same people in the same spots, summer, winter. It is stunning to me that we have as many people who are homeless in this country. I would distinguish it from the kind of torture that we are talking about here tonight that was perpetrated by on people directly by our government as a way of defending, as a way of, at least by their terms, saying that they were defending our national security. So I think that to me is different. But I do think it is completely a problem of a lack of understanding that there is really, in the case of dealing with homelessness, I think it's a fact that we don't understand that we actually have solutions to this, and if we were willing, had the political will to change, that we would not be, we would be a better country for addressing this from solutions. There are many, many issues that are issues of extreme poverty, and I see homelessness as certainly mainly an issue of poverty, of extreme poverty, and of disproportionate housing costs and lack of commensurate services in some cases. And the fact is there are absolutely solutions so that no one would have to be homeless, but that is not where we're putting adequate resources as within our federal taxpayer dollars. So yes, I think it's a violation of human rights, but I wouldn't call it torture.
I think it's also, it's the concept of the other,
Yes.
and Iraqis are the other, and the people sleeping on the streets are the other, they're not us. And I think that's a real problem in this country, and it goes beyond that. It goes way beyond.
I have an online question. Oh,
I
please.
guess I would differentiate in that it is not government policy. The government doesn't encourage homelessness. It doesn't encourage those kinds of things. And so we fall short in dealing with these issues, but it's not something that we say we ought to encourage. So I think that's my difference. We don't have anything that says homelessness is good, for example, as we have saying if you do this torture, that's good for our end result, our end hopes. So I think that we all fall short as individuals, as a nation, but our values are such that we try to be better. In this particular instance, as a government, we condone, we encourage torture to achieve a particular result that we thought was good for the country. It was not.
We condone homelessness.
I think we,
I don't see a difference.
let me ask this question. Given that there is increased pressure on the American government to expose their methods of torture, do the panelists believe that we are headed in a direction of greater transparency?
I would just say that in a democracy is an ever-evolving thing, and transparency is what we're striving for. Are we more transparent than we were 15, 20 years ago? I'd say yes. Will we be more so 15 or 20 years from now? I would say yes. The more informed a democratic nation is, I think the stronger the democracy is. Are we fully transparent? No. And that's one of the things we're trying to encourage by having them make these reports available, open to the public, and be more transparent in future actions.
Yes, sir.
I have, my name is Chris with Witness Against Torture, but I have two things. I do think that it's fair to say that, like, governmental policies like that held up the Jim Crow South were equivalent to torture in our history, and the School of America's what? School of America's was a government policy that did, train people and support torture in other countries. So I do think it's a larger part of our history as the United States than just after 9/11. But that's actually not my question. My question is like talking about transparency and the current Ahmed Abu Khattala, who's was the current suspect for the Benghazi thing, is currently like in international waters being interrogated outside of any legal jurisdiction. And I just wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
The question is that there's currently an interrogation occurring on international waters for a man who was suspected to have killed, been involved in Benghazi. And what are we doing about that?
Well, my personal hope is that he will be transferred to a U.S. jurisdiction and put into our judicial system to try the case on the facts. I would prefer that he not be in wherever he is, It's not a black site, but it's somewhere we don't know. Pardon?
It's equivalent to
Yeah, well,
just
yeah,
a black
yeah.
site.
So that's my personal hope, and I would think that, given what I hear from the Obama administration, that would be the next line of what they do.
I would just say that in terms of transparency, it's hard. I think we probably are a little bit. I mean, I think there's always a push, and I think the fact that there's a public outcry about and demand to have information is really important. So I think citizen engagement to ask these questions is critically important. I do think there's, for reasons that we heard so clearly, a desire to cover this up. I mean, you know, who wants to admit that this is something our government did, even though we now know that this is something our government did in terms of this torture. So I think that the kinds of work that like the Constitution Project's work and those who are working to promote rule of law and to promote, you know, the fact that, you know, there should not be extrajudicial activity going on, that we actually have systems for making decisions about criminal activity, and those should be followed. And so I think anything that we can do to promote rule of law, both within our own country and other countries, is very important. But it is difficult, if we are violating that, to be calling other countries violators of that.
Okay, I see several hands. I'll ask you, and then, please.
Hi, my name is Marie from Michigan Torture Too. I guess I have a question because like Guantanamo has been open for 12 years, and many of us have been working to close Guantanamo for many years. And so I guess I'm interested. You talk about we need to garner political will to install transparency or all these other practices. What brought about this project, I guess? Like, what helped bring you guys together to do this? And like, could that help inform our activism?
The question is, why did what was the impetus behind the formation of the task force on detainee treatment?
Well, first of all, the Constitution Project has taken on these issues, rule of law issues, many, many times for quite a few years now. When it became clear that the Obama administration was not going to have a review of what happened, or anything similar like they did in South Africa, et cetera, and when Senator Leahy introduced legislation to do it through Congress, and that went nowhere, the Constitution Project, Virginia Sloan, stepped in and said, this is the kind of thing that we need to do as for our country, for our own sake. And that's when she assembled the task force. We went into it, and again, all of us felt you go into it with an open mind. I didn't know what the facts were. I had no idea where we were going to come out. My only concern, as I said before, is that a partisan or a philosophical bent not rule the day, that you really tried to follow the facts and where they led you, and then issued your report. And I think the full task force did that marvelously. As far as Guantanamo is concerned, it is getting aside from the moral issues, whether it's right or wrong the way we're treating the prisoners. It is a problem for our foreign policy. We cannot rule the world. And to be able to influence how things happen in the world, we have to have allies. Some of those allies are very much different than we are as a nation. And we hurt ourselves in building those allied groups by having a Guantanamo. It's like sticking your finger in their eye. So for foreign policy alone, I think it should be closed. You have a situation where Congress, and some lawyers will interpret this differently, but where Congress has basically blocked the president from closing Guantanamo. And they do that, since I was in Congress a long time, I know the different kinds of motivations that affect members of Congress. Some of them believe it, some of them it's political cowardice, but the fact is, you've got to help. Congress has got to give some leeway before it can be done. We would be much better off transferring those prisoners to U.S. jurisdictions and putting them in U.S. prisons, let our rule of law run its course, and either release them or put them in jail for a long time. When I was ambassador to Mexico, one of our missions was to try to interrupt the drug organizations. And the only time I had a real threat on my life was when we went after a major drug lord. And we finally, with the Mexicans taking the lead, caught him. There was a lot of complaints in Congress about taking drug lords and putting them in U.S. courts and U.S. prisons. Well, that particular drug lord was captured, sent to Houston, went through the process of our judicial courts, was convicted, and now almost 20 years has been in jail in Colorado, totally secure for the people who live there. So we can handle our judicial system, we can handle our penal system that's secure and safe to the rest of the citizens, and we ought to be handling these prisoners in the same fashion.
Yes.
My name is James Connell, and I'm a lawyer for Amara Bellucci. He's one of the men who was tortured by the CIA for 3 years and then transferred to Guantanamo Bay, where it hasn't really stopped. They've stuck him in solitary confinement for the last 8 years, and I represent him in a military commission that was set up solely really for the purpose to cover up torture. And my question is for Dr. El-Hibri, and it is, why do you think it is that if a person, we've had 500 people accused of terrorism in the past since September 11th, and only the Muslims get sent to Guantanamo Bay, whereas a wide variety of religions and ethnic backgrounds get tried in federal courts. Have you thought about that, and do you have any opinion on why that division seems to have been made?
Well, if
The
you're
question is, sorry, Dr. Libri, of the many people who have been accused of torture, why is it that only the Muslims are transferred to Guantanamo as opposed to being tried in federal courts?
If you're trying to suggest that many Muslims believe that what we're seeing now is a war on Islam, there are people overseas who seriously take that position, and I think what you just said addresses the fact that we need to be concerned about our foreign policy and how people perceive us. But I think we need to see this in a wider context. There have been issues like that, not necessarily torture, but mistreatments of segments of society in one form or the other that has happened in our history. One of them is the African Americans, slavery. I would say there was torture there if you look deeper into the treatment. Some of the groups that have been supporting us on the Guantanamo thing, just a few days ago I was talking to somebody representing the Japanese community who had also gone through an experience like that. We could mention others. So I think we should have a historical view of what is happening. We are at a juncture now where a lot is happening in the Middle East itself, as you all know, and the US is deeply involved in that. And so basically by reason of this involvement, you're not gonna get Japanese arrested there, right? You're gonna get generally Muslims arrested there. You could see that, if you wish, as an attack on Muslims or on Islam. But there are American Muslims in this country, and we want to make sure that this country basically stands true to its constitution, which respects all religions, including Islam, which has been around in this country since the 16th century. This is something very few people recognize. It didn't just come on the boat with the recent immigrants or on the planes. It's been here a long time. Now, it is true that there have been some tension between East and West historically, and since the people who founded this country came from Europe, they came with certain attitudes towards Islam, but this country is a lot more diverse than it ever was, and there is a lot of shifting in thinking and in approach, and I think we should all hear. I think the American Muslims have a historical role now to play, and a historical opportunity to explain Islam to the West and explain the West to Islam and build those bridges, and I think we can.
There were some hands in the back. Yes.
My name is Helen Schiedinger, and I'm with the Torture Abolition Survivor Support Coalition and the Witness Against Torture. And my question is for Ambassador Jones. I'm just reading the report, and under the finding number 21, it says the Convention Against Torture requires that each state party to criminalize all acts of torture, attempts to commit torture, or complicity or participation in torture, and proceed to be a prompt and impartial investigation where there is a reasonable ground to believe that an act of torture has been committed in any territory under its jurisdiction, and the United States cannot be said to have complied with this requirement. And yet the recommendation, as I understand it, only suggests going forward in the future with any situations where a person has been found to have inflicted torture. Why is the report not recommending that the people within our government, especially high officials who have encouraged this practice within the government and made it policy, why do you not recommend in the report that they be investigated?
What we tried to do at the beginning was,
I'm just going to repeat. I'm sorry. I'm going to repeat the question. The question is aimed at recommendation number 21 in the report, which discusses criminalizing torture. And the question is, why did the task force not recommend that the officials who are perpetrating torture be investigated?
in the beginning of our discussions, we decided that this was not going to be a criminal report and try to identify who committed a criminal act. What we tried to do, and it was partially because we wanted to look at the broad picture to see what had happened and then what we should be doing going forward. But by laying out what had happened, law enforcement could read that and figure whether or not they've got a case. But we didn't think it was our responsibility to be the grand jury. It was more a commission to tell the nation, this is what we found. This is not right, and going forward, we have to change it.
Yes. Yes.
So I have a couple of questions. It seems like there's not really that much emphasis on survivors of torture. I know Dr. El-Hibri kind of mentioned it. But given that, for example, Guantanamo Bay has had 600 plus prisoners released, how come there's not more discussion about what is actually happening to these prisoners post-release, post-torture, et cetera, and what is the U.S.'s responsibility towards them? And as we know, a lot of these former prisoners get sent to random third countries where they don't speak the language, they don't have access to the resources, they're separated from their families. So what is the U.S.'s responsibility towards them? And with the question also of U.S. responsibility, there's also this narrative of, we can't close Guantanamo Bay because not enough countries will accept these prisoners. Why is it always that the responsibility is put on other countries to accept their prisoners when it's really the responsibility of the U.S. to accept the prisoners?
Okay, there are two questions. The first is, what is the emphasis on the survivors of torture, and what is the U.S.'s obligation to those that have been released after having been detained? And the second question is also about responsibility. Why is that responsibility being shifted to other countries as opposed to the discussion surrounding the U.S.'s obligation to these survivors?
I'll try to answer the first question. Indeed, I don't believe much has been done by our government to follow up or to make reparations in one form or the other towards people, some of whom were children at the time that they were detained, and who were sent to, for example, some of the Chinese Muslims ended up in some nice island, but like you said, that's not their country. They don't know the language. They didn't choose to be there. That's one country that said, okay, we can take 3 of them or 4, as opposed to the whole group. Even that group was divided as they were being released. So there is a sort of lack of respect of the humanity of these people as they're being released. And other countries are saying, If the U.S. is not willing to take them internally, why should we take them? So they are like a hot potato being thrown around. But finally, when they do find a country, maybe if they are, say, Muslim Arab, and they find an Arab country that will take them, the people in that country look at them as, you are terrorists. You're from Guantanamo Bay. I don't want to have to deal with you. And that really increases the problem quite a bit. Partly because the U.S., when it releases them, it gives them a certain designation, no longer enemy combatant, something like that. It doesn't say they're innocent, found innocent, or found not guilty. So this keeps actually following them, and it is a problem, and I think it would be something if we are able to find ways to help these people around. By the way, there's one thing we didn't talk about, which is recidivism, which is usually, we are told, is pretty high, but in our report we found out differently. We found out that depending on how you look at the numbers and how you define your categories, that in fact it is not established that many of the people who go back re-engage. In fact, if what I'm saying in the report is correct, that they go back broken and having problems, they'll be lucky if they can continue standing on their feet. Not to say that none of them ever returned or engaged, even if they haven't ever done it in terrorist activity. I'm sure there are some, but that's not the majority.
Yes.
There's a second question.
Oh.
Right? You were gonna
Was there
ask.
another? Oh, the second question, why is the responsibility being shifted from the U.S. to other countries in response to the survivors?
Well, I think, I don't know for sure, but my sense is that the current administration is trying to find a more humane way to deal with a situation when the political odds against them are so high. You can't bring to this country politically, it's going to be impossible right now. And so the question is, if they're going to be released, let's have them released to a country that is friendly and make certain assertions that they're going to be treated as they might be treated here in the United States. If that political condition changes, then they might be able to be released here in the United States. But my view is we ought to follow our own rule of law. And the people who are remaining at Guantanamo ought to be removed to the United States. If we don't have enough evidence to convict them of what we're charging, then we should release them, and that release would probably be in the United States. If we do have, we ought to put them in our own jails.
Yes, sir.
I'm Richmond at Harvard University. I've got a question about both terminology and strategy. Tonight we talked only about torture, which is entirely appropriate because torture. But the American legal standard is, the American legal prohibition is against cruelty, which is a lower level of abuse. That's also the international human rights standard and the international legal standard. Are we framing the issue incorrectly by only talking about torture? Should we be trying to focus on cruelty and seeking to abolish the use of cruelty and hold people accountable for the use of cruelty rather than the higher level of abuse?
The question is about terminology and strategy, whether we should be framing the issue as one of cruelty as opposed to torture.
Actually, I did cover some of that in my presentation, and the report talks about it quite a bit. SID, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. So we don't focus only on torture.
I would just say that I think that I think the definition is a question and how people define it. I mean, even the term torture is defined differently by different people and different actions, but certainly the National Religious Campaign Against Torture has also taken on the issue of solitary confinement, that, you know, as an issue of torture, as an issue of cruelty. I think in terms of, I mean, I appreciate the distinction because I think it is important to note that there are ways that we mistreat people that one might not label torture, but that in fact are still reprehensible.
Yes.
I'm Alice Zachman. I've worked with survivors of torture for several years. What I'm wondering about is why does the United States continue the school of the Americas, where generals and army people from Latin America are trained to torture. And people have been trying to close the school of the Americas for years, and it hasn't happened. And so I'm wondering, why do we allow such a school in our country to continue to train other people and from other countries, especially Latin America?
The question is, why does the U.S. continue to allow the School of Americas, where people, especially from other countries, are being trained in methods of torture?
I'd be happy to try to take effort to make to answer that. I don't really have a full answer, but I can say that from our role with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, we haven't specifically worked on trying to close that School of Americas, which I understand now has a different name, which I can't recall, but I was actually in a meeting recently with religious leaders, and there was someone from the White House there, and she was actually talking about the humanitarian crisis on our own border right now with children, immigrant children coming over, and citing the fact that that it is often, for many of those children from Guatemala and Honduras, it's violence within the countries, and one of the nuns asked the question, well, we have, perpetrated some of that violence by our own training of military commandos in those countries, and I don't think it quite connected, but I guess we actually strongly believe that that way too often, both that our foreign policy first option is militarization, and that that there must be other ways that we can respond militarily to, or we can respond effectively for an effective foreign policy that doesn't put military response first. And again, I'm not speaking for this report or for this panel, but I do think that if you think about what we're asking people to do, there are ways that we should be engaging with in our foreign policy and in violent conflict even that doesn't require us to use military solutions. There are nonviolent solutions that can be used. There are diplomatic solutions that can be used. We think of what's going on right now. Our own president is saying that we should have political solution in Iraq, and yet we're still using military options here. And so I realize that that's a perspective not everyone shares, but there certainly are ways that we ought to be training people to have nonviolent responses, whether it is in Central America or Middle East.
I would only comment, I'm not an expert on the school. I do know that many of the complaints that were leveled against the School of the Americas a few years ago, that there have been corrective actions supposedly taken. Supposedly, the school is to be training these soldiers, or these military people from foreign countries, with the same training that we would give a U.S. soldier, a U.S. military leader. And the purpose of that, it's tandem. We're preaching democracy in other countries, but for democracy to survive, they have to have institutions that develop, and those institutions have to be defended. Guatemala, for example, and Honduras, the institutions of democracy really don't exist because the drug organizations are running the country. And so one of the purposes of that school is to help train the military so that they can defend against those criminal organizations. But I know the complaints against that particular school in the past. My understanding was that there have been a number of changes, and it's the same kind of training they would give to a U.S. soldier.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Omar Kurdi, and I'm here with Amnesty International. But first, I'd like to thank the panel for providing the event. It was a very, very nice event. Second, I've been hearing what's been said, and it seems to me that there is, we talk about the historical significance, or when my colleague over here asked about kind of the discrimination that happened, or what the different patterns that torture takes, it seems to me that there's a systematic problem. And if the panel agrees that there is a systematic problem, what do you think the systematic problem is, and where is it coming from?
What is the systematic problem, and where is it coming from?
Well, without going through all 25 findings and recommendations, I really urge you to read the report, because that's what we were trying to look at. What was systemically going on that should not have been going on, and how do you correct it?
Yeah, you've had your hand up for a while.
I have two questions. The first being, you mentioned, Pastor Jones, that you expressed the hope that these detainees will be brought to the US and then tried here. What do you think in the legal context for countries which, for instance, with regard to extradition treaties, and where these are brought in from different foreign countries, how would those extradition treaties play in when these home countries are not willing to let these detainees go out, and these detainees have been captured through illegal means, perhaps? The second question being, we've discussed some countries not being willing to take back their detainees who are currently in Guantanamo or other US prisons. What do you think is the reason that these home countries are so unwilling to pay their obligations to their citizens, and how has the general performance for these home countries been with regard to serving their citizens who are being detained?
Well, there are two questions. The first is you have recommended, Ambassador Jones, that the detainees be brought back to the U.S. to be tried here. What happens in the legal context with countries that don't allow extradition to the United States? And the second question is, why won't a lot of the home countries accept their citizens back after they've been detained?
Let me try the first question. Extradition treaties are usually bilateral, and they differ in some respects. If another country requested that they extradite this particular person we have in our custody to that country, we would have an legal obligation. Well, we go through the process. Sometimes you refuse that request, but most of the time you would honor that request after going through the legal process. I can't say what all of our extradition treaties with these various countries are.
On the second question, we're seeing something similar happening today, not with the detainees, but with the Middle East, where, for example, the people who are engaged in Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra, it's turning out that some of them are Swedish, some are French, some are, different countries. These countries have announced that they don't want them back, and if they come back, they will arrest them. I think it's the same theory. They're afraid of these people because they think they're going to create havoc, and they are terrorists. So in the case of the detainees, since the U.S. has them, keep them. We don't want them on our soil because we don't know what they're going to do. I think in a way, they're not taking responsibility for people who have a passport of that nationality. If you think they are a danger, take them and deal with them. You either rehabilitate them, as in Saudi, or you investigate, you find out what the issue is. Is there a sleeping cell? Is there not? I mean, instead of just closing your eyes to the problem and saying we will not take them back.
Yes, sir. Hey, yes.
We appreciate all the work that's been done. Apparently, we spent some time with the report, but it looks like it gives us some material to work with. Not that it's information that most of us were unaware of, but perhaps with the status of the individuals creating the report, perhaps using it will get us heard. You're talking to a lot of people in this room who have been aware of the problem, who have been aware of American torture, who have been working to try and get the government's attention and action about closing Guantanamo, about releasing those men who have been clearly released, all of the things that you're talking about. And during the closing comments that most of you made, you said get out and agitate for the event. A lot of the people in this room have been doing just that for years. Do you have any, two questions. Number one is, do you have any suggestions beyond what we've been doing in visiting legislators, writing to them, demonstrating on the streets and in their offices, vigiling, writing to newspapers, writing op-eds? We're welcome to take up your challenge. If you've got some new ideas, we'd love to hear them. That's number one question request. Number two, the men whose, the evidence against them has been obtained by torture and would not be admissible in a court of law, an American court of law. I wonder what the panelists' opinions are. Just out of curiosity, what would each one of you do with these men?
Okay, that also includes some of the online questions. It was a good overarching final question, which is that a lot of the people in this room, and I would argue that people who are watching online are people who have already been engaged in awareness about torture, have been engaged in lobbying, demonstrating, using the media. What else can we do to raise awareness about U.S. torture, and what are some fresh ideas? And there was a second question of, what would you do if these were men under your care?
I mean, I agree with you. There are a lot of good Americans who've been talking about this for quite a while, suffering over it individually as well as in their communities. But we haven't seen results. And I think part of the reason is we haven't reached a critical mass. I mean, I'm a creature of the 60s, and maybe you were too, I don't know. But there was a critical mass of the population. In a democratic society, you cannot ignore numbers. We haven't reached those numbers. And the question is, how do you reach them? And I'll say, so you're saying we're doing what you've known all along. Think of Chinese torture, water dropping, drop by drop, and finally it does make an effect. So we're adding our work to your work, and we need a lot more of it. And what happened to teach-ins? How come we don't have these kinds of things where we go around and try to spread the message even further? We need people who are now very busy trying to make a living, because the economy, is a challenge for many people. We have to also understand that part of what we're doing in this country is not just making a living, but upholding our principles, and therefore to do things like teach-ins and so on, and try to get the populace to move in large numbers.
Take a second or two. A second.
I believe in the principle in the U.S. legal system, and also in my religious belief that you're innocent until proven guilty. So I would like to have those people brought to the U.S. and taken into a court. I believe in our court system. We've done pretty well in our court system. Let us decide whether they're innocent or not. If they're not guilty, let us say they're not guilty, so that they can be reintegrated in their own societies. And if they're guilty, let them pay for what they've done.
I agree with the sentiments of using our own court system to address this. I think the other thing I would just say is that I think there are places where grievous actions such as mass atrocities and genocide have happened, and there have been restorative approaches to work through when that kind of deep moral injury has happened. And so I think we should be looking at restorative approaches for that. I would say the one thing I would comment, and I know it's been said here, but this report was bipartisan, but for one recommendation. Do not minimize the value of that in this city at this time. It is incredibly important that there was agreement among a bipartisan group on the findings of this, that I think that needs to be repeated frequently and often. And I realize it's exhausting to repeat yourself to your elected officials month in and month out, but I believe the president when he says he wants to close Guantanamo. But I think he doesn't have I think it will be a scar on his administration and for not doing it. And I think that he sees that, this is my personal opinion, I think he sees that, but he doesn't have any political space to do this right now.
The only thing I would add to these good comments is the bipartisan nature of our commission. After we issued the report, on a bipartisan basis, we had meetings with the NSC, people at the National Security Council, Department of Defense, CIA, and others. And I think they took notice of the fact that we are Democrats and Republicans and maybe conservatives and liberals, and kind of surprised that we came to this unanimous conclusion. And so I think that helped. But I think with folks like you who've been at this for a long time, I would just remind you, it took us 100 years before we got meaningful civil rights legislation, and there were a lot of people just doing the work year after year. The one thing I would recommend is get beyond your borders. We run a risk in the United States, particularly now in the political structures as it is, of just getting with our like-minded friends. Whether you're a conservative, you watch Fox News. If you're a liberal, you watch MSNBC, and you just reinforce with your own people. You got to get outside of your own group and encourage them to do what you've been doing. So I think the wider that circle can be, the more effective it will be. On the last part of the question, I would agree with Dr. El-Hibri, is trust the court system. If bring them to our courts, try them. If they're found guilty, put them in our jails. If they're not found guilty, and we still don't want them, our immigration laws are such that we can deal with it in that fashion. We can expel them or whatever. So, but let the court system run its course.
Thank you. I think we have exceeded our time for questions at this time. So I want to thank you all again, and can we thank our panel once again as well? I'm going to invite Mr. Larry Ackey from the Constitution Project to close out this evening.
So I do want to thank our excellent panelists once again, Ambassador Jones, Dr. El-Hibri, Ms. Randall, our marvelous moderator for the evening, who was in front of the microphone a lot but didn't really get a lot of attention. So thanks to all of you. I want to thank our co-sponsors this evening, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, Amnesty International USA. We've been doing these events across the country. It's great to have a team like that put together that's able to bring people together to discuss this important issue. I want to thank KARAMAH for the use of this beautiful space. This is really a delightful place to hold a meeting such as this. But most of all, I want to thank all of you. I mean, there's a lot of things to do in Washington, D.C. on a summer evening such as this. Sitting in the room talking about torture one more time may not be exactly what you thought a good Tuesday evening might be. But I think it is absolutely critical that we continue to have these kinds of conversations, that we continue to work to expose the truth about U.S. torture, and in the process to restore human dignity. The last question of the night was exactly on point. We just have to keep doing what we've been doing. As Ambassador Jones indicated, within the next couple of months, we're likely to see the report from the Senate Intelligence Committee. The executive summary of a 6,700-page report, only 500 pages have been authorized for public disclosure. It's our understanding that we're likely to see a heavily redacted form of that. We need to let the administration know that that's just not acceptable, that the American people deserve to know what was done in their name, and it can't wait any longer. We need to let the Senate know that the restrictions that have been placed in the National Defense Authorization Act on release of prisoners from Guantanamo are simply not acceptable to the American people. We just need to keep raising our voices wherever we have the opportunity, whenever the chance presents itself. And again, as Ambassador Jones said, we have to get outside of talking to ourselves. We really need to talk to our neighbors, to our co-workers, to our families, to the people in our church, and let them know that if we continue to rise up and make our voices heard, that we have a chance to finally get beyond the stain on our national character, to acknowledge that we did something as a nation of which we are not particularly proud. But most importantly, we need to recognize that only by exposing the truth can we ever hope to prevent it from happening again. And so with that, I want to thank all of you. Enjoy the balance of your Tuesday evening on this nice summer day, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again. Oh, it's a Thursday, isn't it? This nice Thursday evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.